the unit that we're in right now is focusing on rhythm and meter in our compositions. And last week we looked at a few different ways that other composers have used rhythm and meter. We took a look at some ways of using asymmetrical meters that change the size of the beat from measure to measure or even within a measure. And we also looked at some music that used shifts in rhythm as a compositional device above and sometimes alongside of pitch, right? So what we're going to take a look at today is a way of using rhythm, again, a little bit analogous to the way we might organize a piece with pitch through the use of a technique to change tempo as we go through a piece, in much the same way that we might change keys moving through a tonal piece. And we're going to look at an example of a composer who's very famous for doing this. He didn't necessarily invent the idea, but he certainly took it farther than anybody before him had. And it's a guy named Elliott Carter. If you like the stuff that we listened to today, I strongly recommend that you check out some of his other music. He has a fantastic piano concerto. He is one of only a handful of composers that has won the Pulitzer Prize twice for his second and third string quartets. So if you like the stuff today, I strongly encourage you to check that stuff out. What I want to do first is just take a look at this piece, and we're going to listen to this little excerpt of it. And so at the beginning, Carter has marked, as you can see, dotted quarter equals 90. Pretty kind of middle ground metronome marking there. But there are a few other places where he's got things that look a little bit like metronome markings, but are a little bit different. So I want you to pay attention to those moments when they occur. I have them in red here. Your printouts are in black and white, but you can see on the screen they're red. So pay close attention to those as they come up. And what I want you to do as we listen to this now is to kind of conduct along. So you're going to get a little bit of a hiccup there at the beginning because it starts off of beat 1, but kind of conduct along in 2 and 1 when we get to ones, and try to follow the tempo changes that happen through this opening bit. This is about the first, I don't know, 20% or so of this piece. This is for solo timpani. So all you're going to hear is timpani. So that's not wrong. If all you hear is timpani, that's correct. If you hear more, we should talk after class. Hey, grab a handout. So what happened at those moments?
He sped up by a 30-second note.
He sped up by a 30-second note. Okay.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
Can you be more specific? He is changing speed. The question is exactly how he's changing speed, right? So look at how we're defining the tempo there at the beginning, right? When we look at the tempo, the way he's defined it at the beginning, he's saying that the dotted quarter note equals 90. So there's kind of an equation that's happening right there, right? We've got this standard thing of 90 pulses to a minute. So that's going to happen 90 times in a minute. Well, what he's saying there is we understand what that is, and this thing is going to happen at that rate. So that quarter note there, that dotted quarter note is happening at that rate. Here, we're doing something different. We've got a new equivalence that's happening here at this point in the score, right? So he's saying at this point, the dotted 16th, whatever the old dotted 16th value is, that's going to be equivalent to the 8th note in the new tempo, right? So this thing that was the dotted 16th is going to become the 8th note in the new tempo. So does that mean it's getting slower or faster? We've got a smaller note that is becoming the equivalent of the bigger note.
That would make it faster.
It would make it faster, right? So the thing that has been the length of time that we assign to a dotted 16th is now going to be assigned to a quarter note, right? So that means the dotted 16th is going to have to get faster if there's going to be more dotted 16ths. That is a thing that Carter is, as I said earlier, credited with popularizing and taking to a real extreme in a lot of his music. We'll sometimes call a tempo modulation or a metric modulation. So these two terms, by the way, I should say, are used more or less interchangeably. The kind of more commonly used term, I would say, is metric modulation. But oftentimes, the thing that is modulating is not actually the meter, but the tempo. And the result is really that we're changing tempos. So I want to take a look at how these tempo modulations work in practice. So what this thing says, as I said earlier, is that the length of the dotted 16th on this side, and that's an important thing. You'll see this in a lot of music like this, is we have these arrows that say the one on this side is going to become the other thing on this side of the equal sign. And so this says that the dotted 16th over here is going to become the 8th note over here. And so we can actually figure out what that tempo is. And this, I know we didn't get into music composition necessarily to do arithmetic, but there's some arithmetic that's involved here. So get out your calculators, or your slide rules, or your abacuses, abaci, and follow along. So if we want to know what the new tempo is, we need to be able to figure out what the rate of this rhythm value is that's part of this conversion, right? So we know that a dotted quarter note equals 90, right? So we need to get from the rate of the dotted quarter note to the rate of the dotted 16th note, right? So how many dotted 16th notes go into a dotted quarter note?
6. No.
Dotted 16ths. You're close. You're thinking of 16ths. We want to know dotted 16ths. 4, right? So we've got 4 dotted 16ths go into a dotted quarter. So to get from the rate of the dotted quarter note to the rate of the dotted 16ths, it's a factor of 4. Is it 4 times slower or 4 times faster? Faster, right? So we need to get a bigger number. And the reason I bring that up, obviously this is not a hard question for anybody that's gotten past like week 1 of reading music, whether 16ths are slower or faster than quarters. But it's really easy to mix those up when we're doing this arithmetic, to multiply when we meant to divide, or divide when we meant to multiply. And so I always like to do my own mental Dr. MacDonald's an idiot check to make sure that I am going to get the result I expect. I need this number to get bigger, and that means I need to multiply, okay? So this number needs to get bigger because we need to go faster. So to get faster by a factor of 4, we're going to just multiply by 4, right? Scholars, 90 times 4, 360. Very good. Thank you, Jennifer. So 360. So that means that these things are going by at a rate of 360 those per minute. So this was going by at 90 of those per minute, and now we're going at 360 of those per minute. Now this 360 goes right across, right? When that equals means equals, just like in math. So we've got 360 here. That means these are going by at 360 per minute on this side of the modulation. Okay, so this is this side of the modulation, this is this side of the modulation. Now we need to go the other direction. So we've got 360 to the 8th note. Now we need to get from the 8th note to the dotted quarter note. How many 8th notes are in a dotted quarter note? 3, right? So we want 3 times slower or 3 times faster? Slower, right? So we need to divide by 3. So 360 divided by 3 is 120, right? So what we have done here is we have created a rhythmic relationship between 2 different tempos, or tempi, if you want to be a pedantic Italian. So if we're shifting from 90 to 120 normally, that's not necessarily going to be a relationship that we would hear. Right? We don't normally think of, in most of the music that we play, having a rhythmic relationship between 2 sections that have different metronome markings. Right? We just say, all right, we stop this one and we start this one, and that's it. We might have a fermata in between, we might have a grand pause in between, there might be some big change in something else. But what this is doing is exactly the same thing as a tonal modulation. When you think of the very first kinds of tonal modulations that you discussed in Theory 1 and 2, you were talking about common chords and a pivot chord, right? And what you did was you took a harmony that was in between these two spaces, and you said, well, it's actually exactly the same notes. Maybe we'll respell one or three of them enharmonically, but there's the same notes, and outside of any context, it's going to sound the same. But I'm going to reinterpret this. Over here, I thought this was 6, and now I think it's 2. And so we're going to convert the idea of 6 to the idea of 2, and then we get to the dominant, right? The same thing is happening up here, right? We've got this note value, and we are going to have the same amount of time, right? What this is saying is these take the same amount of milliseconds in clock time, essentially, and we're now converting them to this new thing. We're taking this same idea, and we are recontextualizing it. So this amount of time in this context is a dotted 16th note, and the same amount of time, the same amount of rhythm in the new context is an 8th note. And so what this does, just as a tonal modulation allows us to draw a connection between two key centers and switch almost kind of as a surprise. And we may not realize it until before or after it's happening, right? A lot of times at the moment of the pivot, we don't realize that the pivot is happening. We might have some little hint before, or we might have some confirmation after, but at the moment of the pivot, we may not always hear it. The same thing is going to happen here, right? We don't always hear the tempo modulation happening at the moment that we rewrite the thing, but we'll hear this is kind of a funky rhythm here, these subsequent dotted 16ths or dotted 8ths that we had leading up to it. A lot of times we'll hear it there and see it happen here. Did you have a question, Jennifer? The math, yes.
I mean, there could be an easier way to do it, where you just do like the dotted, like you do it as a fraction. Like the 8th note, there's 4 32nd notes in 8th note, and so the fraction for a dotted 16th note to an 8th note is 3/4. So if you do, because 90 to 120 is a 3/4 fraction, so if you do it like, you know what I'm doing?
Yes, so I think I know what you're saying. And the danger there, this is a really common pitfall when we're looking at metric modulations, is that the rhythmic value between these two things doesn't actually count for anything, right? It's just a coincidence. So the thing that you're observing is absolutely true, but in this case it's just a coincidence that these two things are related by a ratio that is similar to the relationship of this to this and this to this, right? This could be going to a half note, right? This could be going to the 8th note of an 8th note quintuplet, right? So the equal sign is actually a little bit of a weird thing if you're thinking of it in terms of ratios. But that is certainly an important thing to note. And I think the thing that I like to think about is just very, very simply whether it's going faster or going slower after the modulation. Alejandro?
I guess it's kind of a dumb question, but why not just do dotted or dotted quarter note equals 120 at that specific section?
Oh, to just write the new tempo? Mm-hmm. That is something that you should do. And in fact, when you look at Carter's score, he has both pieces of information. So in the handout, I took out Carter's new metronome markings so that we could take a look and do the arithmetic. And very frequently, when you see a metric modulation, you'll get both pieces of information. However, it's more important for the performer to see this rhythmic relationship, right? Because this rhythm is not arbitrarily determined, right? If you look in greater context at what's actually going on in the score, right? You can see that he's not just randomly picking a dotted 16th note, right? He's picking the dotted 16th note because he's been playing dotted 16th notes. And so this is the rhythm that he wants us to hear as the new kind of foundational piece of the new tempo, right? So if there was not that relationship, then there's absolutely no reason why we wouldn't want to just say quarter equals 120, figure it out. But this shows again, just like that pivot chord that we said earlier, this shows the relationship across these 2 points. Now there are a lot of places where we're going to see similar things in this piece. Some of them are going to be very simple. This is probably the most common kind of tempo modulation or metric modulation, and you've probably seen this in music that you've played, even if you haven't played anything quite as complex metrically as Carter. You've probably seen moments where you've got 8 equals 8th, and that is a very simple kind of metric modulation, right? We're just saying that over here, we were, in this case, this beat is governed by a dotted quarter note, and this beat is governed by a quarter note, right? So that's a much simpler metric modulation. So we know already, we've determined already at this point, so this is the metric modulation that we just took a look at here. So we know that at this point we're at dotted quarter equals 120, right? So I want you to take a moment. We can do this in groups. So Alejandro and Ryan and Krista and Jennifer, you guys want to work together on this? And I want you to kind of work through the remaining metric modulations on this page. So figure out, in this case, what is it that we're going to want to know? Well, we're in 3/4, so we probably want to know what the quarter note is. Now we get to 3/8, we might want to know what the dotted quarter is, and then 3/4, the quarter again. All right, so everybody's got this first one, right? Everybody's got here, quarter equals what?
180.
180, right. And now this next one's pretty easy. Quarter equals dotted quarter. What's the new dotted quarter? This is almost a trick question. 180, right? We're still there. And in fact, at this point in the score, this is one of these places Carter actually writes, so he's got this, and he writes quarter equals 180, and then here he writes quarter equals dotted quarter equals 180. So he just writes it all the way across there for you. So this is still 180. So this is the dotted quarter is 180. And so now we're going to do the same modulation again. This is actually exactly the same modulation you did to figure out that 180 at a few measures earlier. All right, so I think we're going to agree here. I think we've got this. We've got it licked. So dotted quarter here is 180. We figured that one out together. We're going to do this conversion. And what does this get us to? What's the quarter note here? 270, right? We all agree on that? Okay. So this is quarter equals 270. And then what do we get here with this last modulation? Our dotted quarter is 190, right? All right. So what's special about dotted quarter is 190? That's where we started, right? So this can treat tempo just like we would treat key, right? We've got a little bit of a cycle that happened here, and we drifted away from our starting point gradually, right? And we sped up that drift at the end, and then we go back and kind of recap that opening tempo. And in fact, if you take a look at the music at that moment, what's it doing? It's recapping that opening idea. It's restating the opening idea there in its original tempo. So Carter is really treating tempo exactly the same way that other composers might treat pitch, as a construct of starting in one place, moving away, gradually, and coming back. Notice that every single one of the modulations that we did between the beginning and this 270 is going a little bit faster. And they start off going a little bit faster, and then a little bit more faster, and then a lot faster, and then slamming back down to 90, just the same way that we might slam back from a big dominant to tonic.
I think I'm just confused. You wouldn't multiply 270 by 3 because there's 3/4 notes, and you're going to find what's the length of the... Oh, you divide by 3.
Right.
Okay, that's...
Yes. So we've got, that's a good question, we've got a quarter note equals 270 here, and the thing that we're trying to figure out is 3 times slower. So this is that thing that I always need to check myself on, because it's really easy to mess up. But just think about whether you expect the number to be bigger or smaller based on whether the rhythm is getting longer or shorter. So that's something that I always need to remind myself. So I want you to listen to this again. We're going to listen to the same excerpt again. And what I want you to listen for is this progression of tempo through this passage. And I also want you to listen for when you actually hear the change. And this is something I mentioned earlier. I think we often spend a lot of time thinking about, as we just did, the moment that the notation changes from being in 1 meter and 1 tempo to being in another meter or another tempo. But a lot of times, the way the music is written, we actually hear the shift before that, because the composer is setting up the new rhythmic value to be the next tempo thing. Or the other way will happen is that the change will happen after the notation change. So in most of these cases, Carter is setting us up to hear the new tempo with rhythm before he actually changes the notation. So if you take a look at this first one, he starts introducing this idea of the dotted 16th all the way up here in measure 3. And then he introduces the dotted eighths to create kind of this duple feel here in measure 7. And then it's this dotted eighth and dotted 16th feel that sets up the modulation, which doesn't actually occur until measure 11, right? And that's, at that point, the sound isn't changing as much as the notation is changing. And the same thing happens in the subsequent modulations as well. So let's take a listen to this. All right. Did you guys hear those changes? Goes by really fast. It's not easy to figure this out by ear the first couple of times. I think, though, once you become accustomed to listening for this sort of thing, it's really interesting. And I think it actually becomes easier to hear once you've heard it a couple of times and understand the relationship between the rhythms and the tempo that the rhythms are expressing. Right? So that's an important distinction to make, is between the rhythm and the tempo, right? Because the tempo is the thing that's changing in the notation. The rhythm is the thing that's changing in what we hear, as well as the notation. Right? So I want to take a look now at the score for the full piece, so we can see more of this. And you can take a look at, this is on Canvas in the score examples folder, or you can just take a look at it up here. So we're going to see a little bit more information. Just to let us focus on the metric modulations, I took some of the things out from the excerpt that we just looked at. But you can see up here that there's a lot more going on in this piece. This is from a set of pieces. I think there are a total of 8. Well, there are. It's in the title. A total of 8 pieces for solo timpani. And they are, a lot of them, based on dances. So the canaries in question are not pretty birds, but they are a Baroque dance called the canary. And you can see there are some really interesting timpani technique things that are going on. I don't think we have any percussionists in the room. So take a look at what he's showing for the timpani part. So what is this thing here at the beginning? So if we're writing for timpani, what is this thing here at the beginning? The tunings, right? So this is what we're going to set the pedals on the pedal timpani to play. Not every piece is going to have a special little bit of staff that shows the tunings. You can often just write the letter names. But for solo timpani, you might give a little bit more of an explanation. And in fact, this is unaccompanied timpani, as you just heard, for all 8 of these pieces, though Carter didn't really expect people to play the full set together. You'll see some other weird notation things here. So in addition to all of the metric modulations or tempo modulations that we saw earlier, you'll note that Carter is giving the new metronome marking at each of those spots that we just figured out. And in fact, he and I agree, or he and us, we all agree on what these metronome markings should be. And we've got some other weird stuff going on. Take a look at the circles here. This is a timpani technique thing. So This C, N, and R. These are all places where Carter is asking the player to strike the timpani. So C is the center of the drum. If you've ever worked with percussionists, you might know that the center of the drum is actually not a place you would normally strike the drum because it's kind of dead. And so you'll actually hear it's much softer when the center of the drum is marked with the C. The loudest part that you'll hear is N. N in this notation is normal. This is, by the way, something that's relatively specific to this work. So Carter's kind of inventing this notation system. Others have adopted it since then, but it's not necessarily standard. And if you ever wanted to write something like this, it would require a little bit of explanation as to what this meant. So N is in the normal position, and R is near the rim. And I believe Carter instructs the player to play as close to the rim as you can where you still hear the pitch, right? He doesn't want just like smacking on the rim itself. He still wants you to hit the drum head to make a pitched sound. And you'll also notice there's another weird thing that I kind of like about this. So he's only got these 4 notes. And unlike a lot of solo timpani rep, he doesn't ever change the notes. So there's no pedaling that happens mid-piece here. He's got 4 notes, an E, a B, a C sharp, and an F natural note with the C sharp. And so his key signature is just a C sharp. Right? He doesn't need the F sharp. In fact, he doesn't want the F sharp. And this really simplifies the piece. And I didn't actually do this in the example that I handed out earlier. It just has the C sharps in it. And you can see how much easier this is to read, having removed all of those accidentals. But you'll hear the difference in the technique as we go through this work. And this is something that I think is important to consider when you're writing for a solo unaccompanied instrument, is to make sure that you're being as specific and really taking advantage of the things that instrument can do uniquely well. So I want to listen to the whole piece this time. And as we do this, listen to how the tempo shifts over the course of the piece, and how just as a common practice composer might take us on kind of a journey through a bunch of different key centers, Carter is going to take us on a journey through a bunch of different tempos and meters through this piece, just exactly the same way. Things are going to get recapped and brought back. There are going to be gestures that are mirrored. So in the opening section that we just took a more specific look at the beginning of class, we got faster every time. Well, there might be other places where we might want to have progressions going the other direction to get slower each time. And there might be some sudden changes and some very gradual changes, just as we saw in the opening as well. So take a listen to, this is going to be the full Canaries.
What is the parentheses accent markings?
The parentheses accent markings, I think what he means is just like a little accent. I actually am not sure about that. I'll have to look that up and get back to you, though.
I've never seen that before either.
Sometimes in historical editions, you'll see that as like an implied accent or something that isn't written in the score, but that might, through performance practice, be handed down. I think in this case, I mean, Carter only died a couple of years ago, but I think in this case, they mean like just kind of let the metric accent happen. You notice that they always happen on the beat. They never happen off the beat. Right. And so what I think what I think Carter is saying with those is let the metric, that agogic accent, happen naturally, as opposed to trying to keep everything flat and even. And that's important in a piece like this where we're changing meters a lot, that you can hear what the meters are. And so he's saying don't like nail it, but just let the metric accent take over. That's what I'm guessing is happening. But I'm going to look it up and get back to you. Or more likely, I'm going to ask Professor Gay, because he is a timpani scholar, and then I'll just tell you what Professor Gay says. Good question. Oh, shoot. There was another technical thing. There's one more technical thing that I didn't mention that happens in a few places just right here in the opening. And this is another one of those things that I took out just for the sake of simplicity. You see these guys? These little boop, boop. What is that? That's weird. Anybody have a guess as what that is? That is where Carter is specifically asking the player to damp those drums at that moment, right? So there's a lot of fast playing that's going on here, and it would be really hard for the player to damp every drum as he or she goes through this piece. However, there are some places where Carter wants some space. Notably, there's a rest at the end of this measure, right? And so to make sure that that rest happens the way he wants it to, he actually asks the player to, as he or she strikes that C sharp, to damp the B drum, and right after that, on that last eighth note, to damp that C sharp drum. So that's what's going on when you see those X's. You see it also in some places, again, where there's these big bits of space here. So this is like a sudden slowdown, right? We haven't had any rhythms this slow, and this is right before we kind of go back to revisit that opening idea, right, as our excerpt ended earlier. So he's saying low two drums, and then as you strike the high two drums, damp the low two drums.
It's like a rhythmic cadence. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, it's absolutely a cadence, right? So and that's an important thing to point out. Thank you for pointing that out, Alejandro. Is, you know, we can have cadences independent of tonality, right? A cadence is just the end of something, and something that informs our kind of understanding of the ending of something even more than tonality in some cases is rhythm. Right? We've got this slowing down of rhythm, and this is literally a cadence, right? No modifier needed. This is a cadence. And in fact, it's a pretty significant cadence because it is right before the end of a section, or it ends a section, I should say. All right, so let's listen to this all the way through. So that's kind of fun, right?
That's impressive for that musician.
Yeah. So any thoughts based on what you just heard?
It's very complex.
What's complex about it, Christopher?
Just the rhythms in each individual measure and everything is just really complex, I guess, for the player especially.
Okay, I think that's definitely true, that this is definitely complex for the player. Do you think that you would perceive anything of this meter business without looking at the score?
No.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so.
What? Why not?
Like even with my own musical perspectives, or just kind of like in general?
In general, do you think this is a thing that you could listen for?
I think you have to know that it was a thing that was written in. Otherwise, you'd say like, "Oh, that man's just playing faster."
You'd be able to hear that there's something going on, but whether you know exactly specifically what it is,
Right? You can point out like, "Oh, he's playing faster now," but you wouldn't know like how that faster got arrived to.
From my own perspective, I would know it's complex. I can hear it that it is complex, but I would not exactly know what's happening. Same as Christopher.
Okay. So I think Christopher's observation is a good starting point, that yes, we can hear it getting faster and slower, for sure. That's absolutely the case. But I think the thing that is the part that makes it something that we can hear, and the part that, for me, makes it interesting that we can hear, is that we hear that the tempo has changed, but that the tempo has changed in a way that is very precise. So there wasn't just a general accelerando or a general retardando, right? It happened very precisely. And also that there is some kind of rhythmic relationship. I think you can hear that there is some rhythm that's happening that bridges the two tempos. Right? And I think if you listen to a little bit more of this music, this is one of the more complex examples of it, for sure. And there are definitely things in here that are really hard, if not impossible, to hear at first. I think all of it you can, through study, eventually hear. I will say that in some of Carter's other music, especially in the third string quartet, it's almost impossible to hear some of the rhythmic relationships, because oftentimes those relationships are happening simultaneously in different parts of the quartet. and going kind of in different directions. So there is a point certainly where it is really, really hard, if not completely impossible to hear, but I think there are a lot of times when you can hear it in something like this. So how are we doing on time? Okay, so we've got to go. I do have an assignment up on web courses. So here is what I'm asking you to do for class next time on web courses. I think I hit the publish button. I may have to go back. It is there? Okay. This is the last little step I sometimes forget. So I'm asking you to write 2 short studies, just a few measures each, and I want each of them to be for 1 or 2 simple percussion parts. So like body percussion, table percussion, like whatever found percussion thing you have. Can be clapping, finger snaps, stomp, vocalized percussion, whatever. Just write something specific. And I want each of these 2 studies to have a metric modulation, right? I want one of them to go faster, I want one of them to go slower, and I want them to not use the exact same ratio, right?
Ratio.
So don't use like dotted eighth equals eighth in the first one, and then eighth equals dotted eighth in the second one, right? So
More like this.
Oh,
Yeah.
between both pieces. I can
Yeah.
do the same song. I'm like, what?
yeah, you got it?
Got it.
Okay. Let me know if you have any questions. I will see you on Wednesday.